Adeline Hartwell buried her father on a Tuesday and learned on Thursday that his will had already sold her. The lawyer read it aloud in his front office, before neighbors, before men who had tipped their hats to her at church. He read the clause plain. She was to marry Silas Rourke inside the month, or the Hartwell land and the Rourke spread both would pass to the noteholder. A man she had spoken to twice. She did not weep. She held out her hand and asked to read the paper herself. Then Harlan Vance leaned in. He held the ranch's $4,200 note, and he said it in front of 11 people. "Marry the widower and lose it all in a season," he said, "or marry me and keep your shoes clean." And at the signing table, days on, Adeline set down the pen. She looked the coldest man in the county dead in the eye, and she said she had a price of her own. If you believe love is built with two pairs of hands, this story is for you. Before we go on, if a story like this is worth an hour of your evening, take 1 second and subscribe, and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far Adeline's story travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning and tell it the way it happened. Adeline Hartwell grew up in a house full of chalk dust and her father's stories. The chalk dust was hers. She had taught the town's children in her own parlor for 6 years and never charged a cent. Farm boys with dirt under their nails, little girls in flour sack dresses, the Peterson twins, who could not sit still for love or switch. She lined them up on benches her father built, and she taught them their letters off a slate board he had hung on the parlor wall with 2 nails and a prayer. Kestrel Bend, Montana Territory, had no schoolhouse. It had Adeline, and her parlor, and the smell of chalk. The stories were Thomas's. He was a talker. Her pa. He ranched a small spread on the east side of the creek, next to the Rourke land, and in the good years the two families had been thick as thieves. Thomas and Silas Rourke. An old man and a young one, friends past all sense, the way some men are. Then the droughts came. Then the fever years. The creek ran low, and the grass burned brown, and one bad season stacked on the next until Thomas Hartwell owed more than his land was worth, and his lungs gave out on a cold spring morning with his daughter's hand in his. She thought that was the whole of her grief. She was wrong. The lawyer's name was Emmett Kroll, and he was not a cruel man. He had known Thomas 30 years, but the law is the law, and a will is a will, and he read it out in that stuffy front office because that was his job. Adeline sat straight in the hard chair. She wore her black dress, the good one, the one she saved for funerals, and would now, she supposed, be married in. The clause was this: to keep the Hartwell land out of Harlan Vance's hands and to honor a promise between 2 old friends. Adeline Hartwell was to marry Silas Rourke within 30 days of the reading. If she refused, both spreads, the Hartwell acres and the mortgaged Rourke range, would fall to the cattleman's trust, and the trust was Vance. Silas was not in the room. That told her something, though she could not have said what. A man had his life arranged for him too, and he had not come. She thought about that later, in the dark, more than she meant to. What she said, in the room, was, "May I read it myself? Mr. Kroll?" He handed it across. Her hands did not shake. She read her father's plan for her in her father's own lawyer's script, and when she was done she folded it once, along the crease, and set it back on the desk. She did not cry. Every soul in that office had come half hoping to see the schoolteacher cry, and she would not give it to them. She had learned young that tears were a coin, and she did not spend hers in public. That was when Vance leaned in. Harlan Vance was a big, soft man who dressed like a banker because he was one, in a manner of speaking. President of the Cattlemen's Trust, 44 years old, pink in the jowls, with a watch chain he liked to touch. He held paper on half the valley, and he wanted the other half. Most of all, he wanted the Rourke Creek. Water in that country was worth more than gold, and the Rourke land sat on the best of it. Cold, clean water off the mountain, year-round. "It's a hard thing, Miss Hartwell," he said, and he made his voice gentle, which was worse. "A hard thing for a lady of your quality. But I'll speak plain, because plain is a kindness." He touched the watch chain. "Marry the widower, and in 90 days his debt drowns the both of you. And I take it all anyway. You'll have buried a husband and a father in a single season and got nothing for it but a mortgage." He smiled. "Or marry me. Keep your school. Keep your parlor. Keep your shoes clean. A respectable arrangement. I'd not press you for anything a lady wouldn't give." 11 people heard him. She counted them later, out of some instinct she did not understand, the way you count stairs in the dark. 11 witnesses to a man buying a woman across the body of her freshly dead father. Adeline stood. She smoothed her black skirt with both hands. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said. "You've made my choice a great deal clearer." She did not mean it the way he took it. He thought she meant him. She let him think it, all the way to the door. The Rourke Ranch sat 2 miles up the creek road, under the shoulder of the mountain, and she went out to see it before the wedding, because she was not a fool. A woman ought to see the things she is being tied to. She hired the Peterson boys' wagon and rode up alone. The house was bigger than her father's, and colder. A good log house, 2 floors, a deep porch, and not one flower anywhere. No curtains in half the windows. A barn that was kept better than the home, which told her where the man's heart lived. There were cattle on the hills, more than she expected, good stock, and a bunkhouse, and the whole place had the feel of a thing that had been loved once and then let go on purpose. A woman met her at the door. Older, gray-haired, aproned, with a face like a closed drawer. The housekeeper. Mrs. Doyle. She had kept house for the Rourkes since before the trouble, and she looked Adeline over the way you'd look over a horse someone was trying to sell you. "He's out with the herd," Mrs. Doyle said. "You may as well see the house." She showed her the kitchen, big and clean and dead. The parlor, with furniture nobody sat in. The stairs, and at the top of the stairs, the hall, and the housekeeper's hand came up quick when Adeline turned toward the north end. "Not that one," Mrs. Doyle said. "The north bedroom. Mr. Rourke keeps it shut. That's all." She dropped her hand. Her voice went flat and quick, a thing said to be forgotten. "Keeps it shut, that's all. This way's your room." Adeline said nothing. She looked once at the north door, plain and closed like any other, and then she followed the housekeeper down the hall. But she remembered it. A schoolteacher learns to notice the one child who won't look up, and she noticed that door the same way. Something was kept behind it. Something a whole household had agreed not to say out loud. Downstairs again, waiting on a man who did not come, she drifted to the parlor mantel to keep her hands busy. There was dust on it, real dust, the kind that gathers where no one lays a hand for months. And in the middle of the mantel, alone, sat a small carved wooden horse. No bigger than her palm. Whittled by someone with skill and love, the mane cut in fine lines. One foreleg lifted as if the little thing were about to run. A child's toy. She did not think. She picked up the hem of her apron and dusted the horse the way she'd have dusted anything, gentle, the way you handle a thing that mattered to someone. She did not hear him come in. A hand closed over hers, not rough, but sudden, and lifted the carved horse out of her fingers. She turned. Silas Rourke stood close enough that she could smell cold air and horse and leather on him. He was tall, dark, 36, and looking older, with a jaw like a shutgate and eyes that had gone somewhere and not come all the way back. Gray at the temples too early. He did not shout. He did not scold. He simply took the horse from her hand without one word, set it back on the mantel exactly where it had been, and turned it a quarter inch so the lifted foreleg pointed the way it had pointed before. Then he looked at her. "Miss Hartwell," he said. That was all. His voice was low and even and gave away nothing, and it was the coldest thing she had ever heard, colder than the mountain, colder than the creek in February. "Mr. Rourke," she said. She would not be small in front of him. "I came to see the place. A woman ought to know what she's marrying into." Something moved behind his eyes and was gone. "Then you've seen it," he said. "It's mortgaged to the roof beam, and it'll likely be Vance's by fall. You'd do better to take his offer." "Everyone's heard it by now. Everyone has an opinion on my life this week," she said. "You're the first to have one who'll have to live with the answer." He did not smile. But he looked at her a beat longer than a cold man should, and then he showed her to the door himself, and that was the first time Silas Rourke and Adeline Hartwell stood in a room together, and neither one gave an inch. The signing was set for Friday, in Emmett Kroll's office, with the same hard chairs. Vance came. That surprised her, until she understood he'd come to watch her marry a dead man's ranch, come to be there when she signed her own drowning. He sat by the wall with his watch chain and his soft pink smile, and he nodded to her like a man already counting his water. Silas came in his good coat, which was to say his least worn one. Kroll laid the papers out. The marriage contract, the transfer of the will's conditions, the whole machine her father had built to save 2 spreads and hand off his only daughter in the same stroke. There was a pen and an inkwell and a place for her name. Kroll read the terms. Silas signed first, his name hard and plain on the line, no flourish. Then, Kroll turned the paper and set the pen by Adeline's hand, and the room went quiet, waiting for the schoolteacher to seal her fate. She picked up the pen. She looked at it, and she set it back down. "Before I sign," she said, "I've a term of my own." Vance's smile flickered. Kroll blinked. Silas said nothing, but he turned his head toward her. "Slow. I'll not be handed over like a heifer at auction, Mr. Rourke." She said it clear, so every ear in the room caught it. "If Pa's will makes me your wife, then you'll hear my price. 100 head. The best of your herd. Deeded, in writing, this day, to build a school in Kestrel Bend. A real school, with a roof and a stove and a bell, so no child in this valley ever has to learn their letters in a widow's parlor again." She lifted her chin. "Marry me and pay me in cattle." The office went dead silent. 100 head, off a ranch that owed $4,200 and 90 days. It was madness. It was a woman burning the roof to spite the rain. Vance nearly laughed. She saw it start in his throat. He was already imagining the herd thinned to nothing, the note unpayable, the whole place his by first frost, and the fool girl's schoolhouse thrown in for free. Silas Rourke looked at her a long moment. Whatever he thought did not reach his face. Then, he reached across the desk, took the pen out of the inkwell, and on a fresh sheet in Kroll's careful hand he watched the lawyer write out the deed of gift, 100 head, deeded to the founding of a school, in the name of Adeline Hartwell. And Silas Rourke signed it. The coldest man in the county signed his herd away without one word of argument, and Harlan Vance's smile died on his soft pink face. Because a man does not give away 100 head of cattle he means to lose. A man gives away 100 head only if, somewhere behind that shut-gate jaw, he means to keep them. It was the first thing about her husband that Adeline did not understand. It would not be the last. They were married the next morning, quiet, in Kroll's office, with Mrs. Doyle and the Peterson boy for witnesses, because Adeline would not have it in the church. She had buried her father in that church 9 days before. She would not stand at that same rail and pretend joy. But the valley would not leave it alone. There was a church social the following Sunday, the kind of thing that could not be missed without more talk than going, and so the new Mrs. Rourke put on her second-best dress and went to supper on her husband's arm, and the whole of Kestrel Bend got its first good look at the marriage everyone was already gossiping about. They looked their fill. The wives had their heads together before the coffee was poured. Adeline heard it in pieces, the way you're meant to. The schoolteacher married a tombstone. Poor thing. marrying a grave with a ranch attached. He hasn't smiled since they buried Ellen and the baby, and now he's gone and buried a young woman alive beside them. One of them, a hard-faced woman named Cora Pedersen, mother to half of Adeline's own pupils, said it just loud enough. She'll be a widow in all but name by Christmas. Mark it. That man's heart is in the ground with the other two. Adeline heard every word. She kept her back straight, and her hands still, and Vance was there, of course, working the room like the churchman he pretended to be. He clapped Silas on the shoulder in front of everyone. He raised his cup. "I want it known," he said, warm as pie, "that I'll hold the Rourke note like a Christian. I'll not press a grieving man. He'll have till spring, and my prayers besides." Which was a fine thing to say out loud, and a knife under the table, because everyone in that room now knew to the day how deep Silas Rourke was in, and knew that Vance was the one holding the rope. Silas sat through it with a jaw like stone. He ate almost nothing. And halfway through the supper, when Cora Peterson said something low to the woman beside her, and both of them glanced at the north end of the Rourke pew as if a ghost sat there, Silas set down his fork, stood, put on his hat, and walked out. No word. No goodbye to his new wife. Out the door and gone, and every head in the room turned to watch the schoolteacher sit there alone at her own wedding supper with her husband's empty chair beside her. This was the moment they were all waiting for. The moment she'd fold. Adeline Hartwell, Adeline Rourke now, set down her own fork. And she stood. "Since I have the room's attention," she said, and her teacher's voice carried clean to the back wall, the voice that had cut through 6 years of squirming children. "I'll say a thing plainly, so no one has to whisper it wrong. There will be a school in Kestrel Bend. Ground broke by summer, God willing, and a roof by fall. My husband has deeded 100 head of his own herd to the building of it." She let that land, let them do the arithmetic on their faces. "So the next time your child asks why he must learn his letters off a slate on my parlor wall, you may tell him the answer is coming. It has a name, and it will have a bell. Good evening." She sat back down. Alone, back straight, in front of the whole pitying valley, and she finished her supper, one bite at a time, while they stared. And not one of them found a thing to say. It was the loneliest hour of her life. She would not have traded it for Vance's clean shoes if he'd thrown in the moon. The work of a ranch does not stop for a bad marriage. Roundup came 10 days on, the spring gather, when every hand and neighbor rode the hills to bring the scattered cattle down and tally the herd. It was hard, filthy, dawn to dark work, and no one expected the schoolteacher to do more than keep the coffee hot. Silas certainly did not. He told her, flat, over breakfast, that she'd best stay to the house. Adeline put on her father's old canvas coat and her one riding skirt, and she rode out with the men. She could ride. Thomas Hartwell had put her on a horse before she could read, and though it had been years, the seat came back to her by noon. She was no vaquero. She got dust in her teeth and a saddle sore that would trouble her for a week, and she ruined her good dress under the coat clean through. But she could count. Lord, could she count. She sat her horse at the mouth of the draw with a stub of pencil and the back of an old letter, and as the herd came down she tallied them by brand and by age and by mark, cows and calves and yearling steers, and she kept a running book in her head the way she kept 30 children's lessons straight at once. At dusk they gathered by the branding fire, and the foreman, a leathery old man named Dutch, gave Silas his count. Silas nodded. Then, because she was standing there, and because she had ridden all day and not once complained, he asked her, half to shame her, she thought, "And what did the schoolteacher make it?" She read her number off the back of the letter. It was 11 head over Dutch's. Dutch spat and rode back up the draw in the last light, and came down again an hour later, having found 11 head bunched in a coulee that his tally had missed. He looked at Adeline a good while. Then he touched his hat brim to her, which from Dutch was as good as a speech. Silas said nothing. But that night at supper, he pushed the ranch's tally book across the table to her without a word, the way he'd pushed away everything else, and it was the first thing he had ever given her instead of taken. She understood it for what it was. It was the closest thing to respect a man like that knew how to hand across a table. She did not thank him. She opened the book and began to read it. And what she found in those pages over the next weeks would change everything. But that is getting ahead. The north room found her before she found it. It was a wet week, the spring rains coming hard off the mountain, and one night a leak opened somewhere upstairs, water running down inside the wall. Mrs. Doyle was aimed with a bad hip. Silas was out in it, in the dark, moving cattle off the low ground. Adeline took a lamp and went up to find the leak before it ruined the plaster, and she followed the sound of dripping down the hall to the one door she had been told never to open. The water was coming from the north room. She could hear it. She had no choice, or told herself she had none, and she lifted the latch and went in. It was a child's room. That was the thing that stopped her breath. Not a storeroom, not a study, a nursery. A small bed with a quilt still on it, a quilt someone had pieced by hand with blue stars. A cradle in the corner, empty, turned to the wall. A woman's things on the dresser, a hairbrush with pale hairs still caught in it, a hand mirror, a folded shawl. A wedding photograph in a frame, a dark young man who was Silas with the ice not yet in him, and beside him a fair young woman with a soft laughing mouth, and in her arms a bundle no bigger than a loaf of bread. Ellen and the boy. And on the little dresser, laid on its side where a child's hand had left it, was a second carved wooden horse. The twin of the one on the parlor mantel. The same fine mane, the same lifted foreleg, about to run. Two horses whittled by the same knife on the same winter nights. One for downstairs, one for up here, for the boy who never grew big enough to gallop it across the floor. She understood the cold then. All of it. The barn kept better than the house. The dust on the mantel where no hand ever fell. The shut door a whole household had agreed to bury with words. The man had lost his wife and his infant son in one hard winter, the fever taking them 3 years back, and he had not opened this door since, and he had built a house of ice around the 2 doors he could not bear to open. This one, and the one behind his own ribs. She was still standing there, the lamp shaking a little in her hand, the leak forgotten, when she heard his boot on the stair. Silas Rourke filled the doorway, soaked to the skin, rain running off his hat brim, and when he saw where she stood, in the middle of the room he had sealed like a tomb, his face came apart in a way she had not known that face could do. It was not rage, though it wore rage's clothes. It was grief, raw and 3 years old, and never once let out. His voice, when it came, was terrible and low. "Get out of this room." "There's a leak," she started. "The wall, get out." She did not argue. She did not weep or explain. She saw a man standing in the only place on earth his heart still lived, and she saw that her being there was a hand laid on a wound that had never closed, and she did the one kind thing there was to do. She set the lamp down where he could reach it. She stepped past him into the hall, careful not to touch him, careful as passing a spooked animal. And she pulled the door shut behind her, gentle, all the way, until the latch caught. Then she stood in the dark hallway with her heart going hard and understood her husband for the first time. He was not cold. He was frozen. And a frozen thing is only a warm thing that the winter got to. She said nothing to him about it. Not that night, not the next morning. She let the door stay shut and the words stay buried. But something in her had shifted on its axis, quiet as a season turning, and it did not shift back. Tommy came to them in July, on the back of a fever. One of the hands, a young married man named Bill Yoakum, had a wife and a little girl in a soddy down the creek, and the wife had died the winter before, and now the child was burning up with the summer fever that took so many small ones in that country. Bill came to the house at midnight, hat in his hands, because he did not know where else to go, and the schoolteacher was known to be gentle with children. The little girl was 9 years old. Her name was Tommy, short for something no one used, and she was so hot to the touch that Adeline's hand came away damp from her forehead. Adeline did not hesitate. She had the child in the good bed and the fever cloths going before Bill had finished apologizing for coming. She sent the Peterson boy for the doctor in the next county, a fee they could scarcely meet with the note hanging over everything, and she did not so much as glance at Silas when she promised the money. She sat up with that child through the whole black middle of the night, wringing cloths, dribbling water past cracked lips, singing low the way she'd learned to gentle frightened pupils, while the fever climbed and broke and climbed again. Silas came and stood in the doorway near dawn. He had not gone to bed. He watched his wife hold a stranger's dying child against her shoulder, watched her rock and hum and refuse, flatly refuse, to let the little thing slip. And something in the man's frozen face was working that had not worked in 3 years, because he had stood in a doorway like this before. He had watched a fever burn through everything he loved and been able to do nothing. And here was this woman who would not stand back and let it, who fought it hand to hand. The fever broke at first light. The child slept, cool and damp and living, and Adeline finally let herself sag back in the chair with her eyes shut. Adeline, her eyes came open. It was the first time. In all the weeks of Miss Hartwell and Mrs. Rourke and long stone silences, it was the first time Silas Rourke had said her given name, and he said it low, from the doorway, like a man testing ice with one boot. "She'll want broth when she wakes," he said, rough, as if that were what he'd meant to say all along. "I'll have Mrs. Doyle put a hen on." That was all. He turned and went down. But he had said her name, and they both knew it, and neither of them said a word about the fact that the coldest man in the county had just called his wife by the name her father gave her. Tommy stayed. There was nowhere else, and no one who wanted a motherless girl, and by the time she was strong enough to sit up, she had decided the school was hers, and Adeline was hers, and that was the end of it. She became Adeline's first true pupil, the very first, learning her letters at the kitchen table while the ranch turned around them. And more than once, in the weeks after, Adeline caught the child standing at the parlor mantel, up on her toes, reaching for the little carved horse, and caught Silas watching the child reach for it, and not, for once, taking it away. The tally book she'd been given held more than cattle counts. Adeline had a head for figures her father always said was wasted on a woman, and through the long summer evenings she set the ranch's accounts straight, page by page, the way she'd have set a schoolroom to rights. And the deeper she went, the more the numbers stopped adding up in Silas's favor, and started adding up in a way that made her sit very still with the lamp guttering low. The interest on the $4,200 note was wrong. Vance had padded it. Not by much on any one page, a few dollars here, a compounding there, a fee named for nothing, but page over page, season over season, it stacked, and by her careful hand the true debt was near $1,100 less than the trust had sworn. And there was more. The water rights. The filings on the creek were misfiled. Deliberately she was near sure, in a way that muddied whether the cold, clean, year-round water belonged to the Rourke land or to the open range Vance was quietly buying up all around it. Get the creek called open range, and Vance owned the only reliable water in the valley without paying $1 for it. Get the debt called larger than it was, and he owned the land the water ran through. It was fraud. Neat, patient, banker's fraud, and it had been running for years under a grieving man's nose while that man was too deep in his own winter to read his own books. She could prove none of it from the ranch's papers alone. But her father had ranched beside Silas for 20 years, and her father kept everything, and somewhere in the old cedar trunk in the Hartwell house, the trunk she had not been able to bring herself to open since the funeral, were Thomas Hartwell's own records of the creek and the boundary and the water. She was near certain of it. The papers that could prove the debt was smaller, and the water was Rourke's, and break Harlan Vance's grip on the whole valley were sitting in her dead father's trunk 2 miles down the creek road. She had not told Silas yet. She meant to ride down and open the trunk in the morning. She did not get the morning. Because Vance moved first, he came up the creek road himself, in his good buggy, on a bright hard afternoon, and he did not come to the house. He caught Adeline alone at the pasture fence where she'd gone to bring in Tommy's pony, and he tipped his hat, and he told her, gentle as ever, that he was sorry to be the bearer. The note, he said, had a clause about improvements to the property, a clause about the removal of secured assets, and deeding away 100 head of cattle, he said with real regret, was removal of secured assets. It voided the spring extension. The 4,200 was not due at first frost anymore. It was due in 30 days. And a new lien, filed that very week, said the herd could not be moved off the land until the note was paid, which meant the 100 head she deeded to her school could not go anywhere at all. I did try to warn you, Mrs. Rourke, Vance said, and he let his soft eyes travel over her ruined hands and her sun-browned face, over the fall she'd taken from the schoolteacher's parlor to a mortgaged ranch. My offer was a kindness, and it still stands. A woman of your quality, breaking her hands on a dead man's debt, for a husband who walks out of his own wedding supper. He shook his head, slow. It needn't be like this. Clean shoes, Mrs. Rourke. A school with your name on it, funded honest, out of my own pocket, and no cattle to lose. All you'd have to do is let this ranch fall where it was always going to fall. Come spring, no one would remember you'd ever been a Rourke. He touched the watch chain. He waited. And Adeline Rourke stood at the fence with the truth of his fraud sitting in a tally book back in the house, and the proof of it waiting in her father's trunk. And she looked at the soft pink man who thought he had just closed his hand around the whole valley, and she understood that he did not know she knew. Not yet. She opened her mouth to answer him. And down the creek road, from the direction of the ranch, she heard Silas's voice call her name. Call it a second time, sharp with something she had never heard in it before, and she turned and saw him coming at a hard walk with a folded paper in his fist and a look on his frozen face that stopped the breath in her throat. Silas came up the creek road like a man walking into wind, though there was no wind. Adeline saw the paper crushed in his fist. She saw his face, and his face was not cold now. It was cracked wide open. "You've been to the house," he said. He was not asking her. He was looking at Vance. Harlan Vance turned, unhurried, and touched his watch chain the way a cat sets a paw on a thing it means to keep. "Mr. Rourke, we were just concluding a friendly talk about your wife's future. Get off my land. Your land." Vance smiled that soft pink smile. For 30 more days, at the outside. He lifted the paper from his own coat, the twin of the one in Silas's hand. The note is called. The herd is frozen where it stands. You gave away 100 head you could not spare, Rourke, and now you cannot even move them to a sale barn to raise the cash. I did try to warn the lady. She's a stubborn thing. He tipped his hat to Adeline, courtly as a snake. The offer keeps. Mrs. Rourke, clean shoes. A school with no man to drag it under. Adeline did not answer him. She had learned that much from Silas already. Sometimes the coldest thing you can hand a man is your silence. Vance climbed into his buggy, the wheels turned in the creek mud, and when he was gone down the road, the two of them stood there in the last of the afternoon light, and neither one could look at the other. 30 days, Silas said finally. Ellen's note was 90. Your father's land was to hold him off till spring. Now it's 30 days for the whole 4,200, and a lien that says the cattle stay put. He opened his fist and looked at the paper as if it might change. I gave your school 100 head I can't get to a buyer. I've killed the both of us. No, Adeline said. You haven't. He looked at her then. He was 40 and looked older, salt coming in at his temples, a mustache gone gray at the edges, and his eyes were the brown of turned earth in a dry year. "I have been in the tally books," she said. "All of them, back 6 years. Silas, the note is a lie." Vance patted the interest, better than $1,100 that was never owed. "And the creek. Your creek. The water rights were filed wrong on purpose, so that come a dry summer the trust could call the water Vance's and the range worthless without it." She held his stare. Pa knew. Pa kept the honest papers. They're in the cedar trunk, 2 miles down the road in his own house, waiting. For a long moment Silas Rourke said nothing at all. Then he said, "Lo, you did that. In a month. In my kitchen. I taught arithmetic to 11 children in my parlor for free," she said. "A man's crooked ledger is not so hard as that." Something moved in his frozen face. Not a smile. "The ground under a smile, maybe. First frost is on us," he said. "The cows are dropping calves early this year, and there's weather coming. If we lose the calves, there's no herd, no school, and no ranch. Papers or no papers." He looked at the sky, the gray shelf of it building over the mountains. "I can't fight Vance and the storm both alone." "You're not alone," Adeline said. "Go get the lanterns." The storm came in that night the way winter comes to that country, all at once and mean. The snow drove flat across the yard. In the barn they worked by lantern light, the two of them and Dutch and Bill Yoakum. The heifers bawling and heaving in the straw. A first-calf heifer is a foolish, frightened thing, and half of them tried to die on principle. Adeline had her sleeves rolled and her arms slicked to the elbow, and her good dress long since ruined and forgotten. Near midnight a heifer went down bad, the calf turned wrong, and Silas got his arm into the shoulder trying to bring the legs around. His face went white with the cold and the effort. "I can't reach the second foot," he said through his teeth. "My hand's too big." "Move," Adeline said. He looked at her. "Move, Silas. My hands are smaller." And he moved. She knelt in the bloody straw in the freezing dark and put her arm in where his had been, and she found the calf's second foreleg folded back. And she talked to the heifer the whole while, low and steady, the way she talked to a frightened child on the first day of school. She brought the leg around. She got both small hooves into the world. And then Silas's hands closed over hers on the wet slick legs, and together they pulled. And pulled, and the calf came out into the straw in a rush of steam and slid there, black and still. "It's dead," Bill Yoakum said. Adeline cleared the calf's nose with her fingers and rubbed it hard with a fistful of straw, rough, the way a cow's tongue would. "No, it isn't," she rubbed. "No, it isn't." "Breathe, breathe, now," the calf shuddered. It coughed, it lifted its wet head and bawled, thin and outraged, and the heifer answered it, and the whole barn seemed to let out its breath at once. Adeline sat back on her heels in the straw, shaking. She was so cold she could not feel her hands. And then Silas took off his coat, his own coat, the heavy sheepskin, and he put it around her shoulders without a word and drew it closed at her throat with both hands, and for one moment his hands stayed there, at her collar. And he looked at her, and the lantern light was gold on both their faces. "Adeline," he said, just her name. But he had never said it before. He had said Mrs. Rourke, and he had said nothing at all, for a month. Now he said Adeline, and the frost broke a little more. "We saved 7 tonight," she said, because she could not bear the way he was looking at her. 7 calves is 7 calves. 7 calves is the school," he said. And then, quiet, get warm. They did not touch again that night. But at dawn, when the storm had blown itself out, and the range lay white and blinding to the mountains, and the newborn calves stood steaming beside their mothers, the two of them leaned on the barn door, too tired to stand, and too tired to move, and his shoulder was against her shoulder, and neither one pulled away. Tommy Yoakum was 9 years old and had no mother. The fever that took Ellen Rourke had, 3 years on, taken Tommy's mother too, and Bill Yoakum could not both ride the range and raise a girl, so the girl had come to live in the Rourke house, where the schoolteacher was. She followed Adeline like a duckling. And it was Tommy. One gray afternoon, while the men were out mending the storm's damage to the fences, who could not find the little carved horse. She had been playing with it. The carved wooden horse off the parlor mantel, the one with the foreleg lifted, the one Adeline had dusted her first day, and Silas had taken from her hand without a word. Tommy had discovered it, and Silas, strangely, had let her keep it about. Now it had wandered, the way a child's things wander, and Tommy went looking, and she went up the stairs, and she found the door at the end of the hall standing open a crack where the storm-swollen frame had failed to latch. Adeline heard the child's feet stop. She came up the stairs and found Tommy standing in the doorway of the north bedroom, the room Mrs. Doyle had told her never to open, the room Silas kept shut. It was a nursery. There was a small bed with a blue star quilt. There was a cradle turned to face the wall. On the dresser sat a hairbrush, with pale hairs still caught in it, and a hand mirror, and a folded shawl, and a wedding photograph. A younger Silas, unbearably young, and a fair woman with a baby in her arms, and beside the photograph stood the twin of the carved horse, the same lifted foreleg, whittled by the same hand. "Whose room is this?" Tommy whispered. Adeline did not answer for a moment. She was looking at the cradle turned to the wall, and she understood at last the whole shape of the cold she had married into. A man does not turn a cradle to the wall unless he could not bear to see the empty middle of it. "It belonged to some people who are gone," she said gently. She took the little girl's hand. "We'll shut it back, and we won't tell about it. It's a private room." But it was Tommy, in her innocence, who found the letter. It had slipped down behind the dresser drawer, an old letter, and the child pulled it free because there was a horse drawn on it, a little pen and ink horse in the corner, and children love a drawing. She could read some. Adeline had taught her. "It says Silas," Tommy said, "and it says, 'My friend.'" Adeline took the letter from her, meaning to put it away unread, and then she saw the hand. She knew the hand. It was her father's hand. She should not have read it. She read it. "Silas, if you are reading this, I am under the ground and past arguing, so you'll hear me out for once. You have not spoken a true word to a living soul since the fever took Ellen and the boy. You keep that room like a wound you're afraid will close. I have watched my friend turn to stone by inches, and I will not go to my grave and leave you there. So I have written the will the way I've written it. Vance wants the land, and I have made it so he cannot have it without you take a wife, and I have named you the wife. My Adeline is stubborn and kind, and she will not weep at your table. She will fight there, and that is what you need, old friend. Not comfort. A fight. Someone to open the door you've nailed shut. I am not selling my girl. I am sending you back to the land of the living, and sending her a man worth the trouble. Forgive an old man his last meddling." Thomas Adeline stood in the dead woman's room with her father's letter in her hands, and the whole thing turned over inside her. He had not sold her. He had saved a friend. The will was not a chain. It was a rope thrown to a drowning man, and she was the rope. And Silas had known. Or half known. He had married her to keep Vance off the range, yes, but Thomas had aimed the whole thing at Silas's frozen heart, and Silas had felt the aim of it, and it terrified him, because to thaw was to betray Ellen, and to love again was a kind of dying. She folded the letter. She did not tell him she had read it. That was her mistake, and it was a mistake made of pride, and it cost them both nearly everything. Because 3 days later, the note came due. 30 days had run to nothing. Vance would not wait an hour past his own deadline. And Silas, cornered, did the thing a cattleman does when the wolf is at the door. He went to Vance to bargain, to buy time, to save what could be saved. Adeline came looking for him at the trust office in town, her father's honest papers finally in her satchel, meaning to lay the fraud on the table and end it clean. She came up the board sidewalk and heard their voices through the open window, and she stopped. "You've beaten me, Rourke. I'll grant it," Vance was saying, oily, unbothered. "The water rights, the padded note, your clever schoolteacher did her sums. I'll unwind the false lien. I'll take my medicine. But answer me one thing, man to man, for my own curiosity." A pause. Adeline could hear him smiling. "It was the land all along, wasn't it? You married the Hartwell girl to lock old Thomas's spread against my note. She was the deed. She was just the lock you put on the gate to keep me out." And Adeline waited for Silas to say no. He did not say no. There was a long silence. And into that silence Vance laughed, soft and satisfied, and Adeline turned and walked back down the board sidewalk with her satchel of papers, and her back was very straight. She did not weep. She had promised her father's memory she would not weep at that man's table, and she would not weep on that man's sidewalk either. She went to the house and she packed one bag. She took Tommy's hand and the school charter she had filed at the county seat with her own name on it and her own deeds in it, and she walked out with her chin level, and she did not slam a single door. Mrs. Doyle stood at the foot of the stairs, gray and stricken. "Mrs. Rourke, the school will still be built," Adeline said. "That much is mine. See that the girl's father knows where she's gone." And she walked out into the spring mud with the child and the charter, and left the ranch behind her. Silas came home to an empty kitchen. The tally book was still on the table where she'd left it, and the door at the top of the stairs stood open. He went up, slow, the way a man climbs to a thing he dreads, and he stood in the doorway of the room he had not truly entered in 3 years, and he saw that the little carved horse was gone from the dresser. The child had taken it. Only the one that had always been up there remained, its lifted foreleg, its patient waiting, and he saw the letter, refolded, set square in the middle of the dresser where she'd meant him to find it. His friend's hand. His own name. "My Adeline is stubborn and kind, and she will not weep at your table. She will fight there." Silas Rourke sat down on the edge of the small bed with the blue star quilt, in the room where his wife and his son had died, and for the first time in 3 years he wept, and he was not ashamed of it, and when he was done, he was not the same man. He rode to the Hartwell house 2 miles down the creek road. He opened the cedar trunk, and he found what she had told him would be there. The true survey of the water rights, the honest schedule of the note, the plain paper trail of every dollar Vance had stolen, and beneath it, one more thing. Thomas's last account book, and pressed inside it a page in the old man's hand, the same last line Adeline had read, meant for the day Silas would come looking. "Forgive an old man his last meddling. I am sending you back to the land of the living." Silas closed the trunk. He had sworn 3 years back that he would never open his grief to the living again, would never stand in front of the whole valley and let them see the raw place in him. He stood up in the Hartwell parlor with the papers under his arm, and he decided to do the one thing he had sworn he would never do. The schoolhouse raising was set for that Saturday. The frame was up on the church common, raw pine bright against the green, on the very spot the valley had gathered to pity her. And on that Saturday, with the whole of Kestrel Bend in its Sunday clothes, and Emmett Kroll the lawyer standing by with his spectacles and his deed papers, and Cora Peterson and the whispering wives in a knot by the wagons, and Vance himself present with the Cattlemen's Trust Board man come down from the county seat, on that Saturday the valley heard cattle on Main Street. They heard them before they saw them. 100 head and more, driven up the middle of the town by 2 riders, and Dutch and Bill Yoakum, dust to the horses' knees, and at the head of them rode Silas Rourke in his shirt sleeves with his hat pushed back, and he drove the whole herd right up onto the church common and pulled them to a mill in front of the half-built school. Adeline stood on the schoolhouse step. The same step. She had a satchel of papers in her hand, and Tommy at her side, and she had not expected him. And her face. She could not make her face behave. Silas swung down. He took off his hat. He handed the deed of gift to Emmett Kroll and said, loud enough for the back of the crowd, read it out. The lawyer cleared his throat and read, 100 head of the Rourke herd, the best of them, deeded free and clear to the school on the common, in the name of the schoolmistress, Adeline Hartwell Rourke, to be sold or bred or worked for the school's keeping as she alone saw fit. That's the 100 she named at the signing, Silas said to the crowd. The 100 everybody in this valley said a mortgaged man couldn't spare. He looked at the mass of cattle steaming on the green. There's 50 more behind them. The calves we pulled out of the snow this winter, her and me, on our knees in the barn all night, those are hers too. He turned and found Adeline on the step. The price she named in cattle was the only honest thing anybody's done in this valley in 3 years, and it's the thing that's going to keep this ranch standing. She saw that before I did. A murmur went through the crowd like wind in wheat. Then Silas Rourke did the thing he had sworn never to do. He reached into his coat and he brought out the little carved horse from the parlor mantel, the one with the lifted foreleg. And he walked up the schoolhouse steps past his wife and into the raw, half-roofed schoolroom, where the new teacher's desk stood in a shaft of Saturday light, and the whole valley crowded to the open doorway to watch, and he set the little horse down on the desk. I carved this for my son, he said. His voice was not steady. He did not try to make it steady. I carved him a horse before he was old enough to hold it. He and his mother died of the fever 3 winters back, in the north bedroom of my house, and I shut that door, and I nailed my own self shut behind it. He touched the little horse's back with one finger. I told myself that grieving them was the same as loving them, and that if I ever stopped grieving, I'd have killed them a second time, and I'd have gone on believing that till I was under the ground beside them, except a stubborn woman married me for 100 head of cattle and would not weep at my table. She fought at it instead. He looked up, and he looked at her, and the whole valley was watching the coldest rancher in the county come apart in the light. Adeline, I've kept a door shut for 3 years. You talked me into opening it, and you never even knew you were doing it. I don't deserve the trouble you've been to me. His jaw worked. Stay, that was all. One word, stay. Adeline Hartwell Rourke stood in the doorway of the school she had bled her hands to build, in front of the same faces that had pitied her, and she did not answer him with words. She crossed the raw pine floor. She took his hand, the hand that had pulled calves beside hers, the hand that had closed her collar in the freezing barn, and she led him back out onto the schoolhouse step. And she put his hand on the rope of the small brass bell, and she closed her own hand over his, and together they rang it. And the valley, God help them, cheered, but there was still the matter of Harlan Vance. He stood at the edge of the common in his good coat, soft and pink and no longer smiling, and beside him stood the trust's boardman, a lean gray fellow, named as had come down to see the notes settled, and found himself watching something else entirely. Adeline came down off the step with her satchel. She did not raise her voice. She had 11 years of teaching in her, and she knew you never need to raise your voice if you have the facts. She laid the papers on the long trestle table where the churchwomen had meant to serve the raising supper, one at a time, and she named each one as she laid it down. The true survey of the creek. Down it went. The water rights were filed to read as the trust's. They are not the trust's. They are Rourke's, and always were, and here is the plat that proves the filing was crossed on purpose. Down went the next. The honest schedule of the $4,200 note. And here, she laid the last one flat and smoothed it, the true schedule, with better than $1,100 of interest padded onto it that Mr. Vance was never owed, and knew he was never owed. She looked up at the boardman, not at Vance. The false lien he filed to freeze the herd was built on the same arithmetic. My father kept the records. He was a careful man. He knew what Mr. Vance was. The board man picked up the papers. He read them the way a man reads a thing he has half suspected for a long time. The common had gone quiet enough to hear the cattle breathing. "Harlan," the board man said at last, and his voice was very dry, "is there anything in these you'd like to call a lie?" Vance's mouth opened. The soft pink assurance was curdling on his face, going blotchy at the edges, the arrogance draining out of it like water out of a cracked jug. "The girl is a schoolteacher playing at law," he said. "She's Rourke's wife. Of course she'd. The plat's the county's own plat," the board man said. "The filing date's the county's own date. This isn't the girl's arithmetic, Harlan. It's yours." He set the papers down. "You'll not hold another note in this county. The trust doesn't want its name on this, and it won't have it. Consider your seat on the board vacant as of this minute." And there it was, plain, in front of the whole valley, the respectable marriage Harlan Vance had offered Adeline exposed for what it had always been. Not a kindness, a bid to marry his way onto the last creek in the valley he did not already own, to take the water and let the range die and buy it cheap. Every wife on that common, who had whispered that the schoolteacher married a tombstone, was doing a new sum now, and the answer had Vance's name at the bottom of it. He looked around the common for one friendly face and did not find one. He put his hat on. He walked to his buggy alone, past the whole valley, and the only sound was his own boot heels on the church steps. And he climbed up and turned the horse and drove out of Kestrel Bend, and the crowd let him go the way you let a bad season go, glad to see the back of it. Cora Peterson was the one who had said it loudest at the church social. "Married a tombstone," she'd said. "Poor foolish girl." Now she stood by her wagon with two of her children, and she watched the schoolteacher ring the bell over the new school with the rancher's hand under hers, and Adeline watched the arithmetic move across the woman's face, the free school, the funded desks, her own children with nowhere else to learn their letters, and watched it come out where arithmetic like that always comes out. Cora Peterson straightened her bonnet. She marched her two children up to the schoolhouse step, and she said, stiff as a woman can be while surrendering, "Mrs. Rourke, I'll want these two enrolled. And the little Yokum girl tells me you take them whether the family can pay or no." "I do," Adeline said. "Well," Cora looked at the raw, bright frame of the school and the cattle on the green and the rancher in his shirt sleeves, and she found she could not hold on to her own old words. "Well, it's a fine thing. I'll say that. It's a fine thing you've built." And she got her children signed onto the roll, first thing, before her neighbors could beat her to it. Spring came on the way it does in that country, all of a sudden after holding back so long you'd stopped believing in it. The snow went off the range and left it green to the mountains. The creek ran full and clear and lawfully Rourke's, and the water rights lay filed correct in the county book where any honest man could read them. The schoolhouse stood finished and white against the green, with a small brass bell in a little cupola over the door. On a fair morning, Adeline Rourke stood on the step and rang it, and out of the yard came the children, 11 of them and more now, the Peterson 2.5 the valley's little ones, and Tommy Joachim in front with her hair in a braid Adeline had plaited that morning at the Rourke kitchen table. Inside, on the teacher's desk, stood the carved wooden horse with the lifted foreleg, and beside it stood a second one, fresh whittled, the wood still pale and sharp at the edges, that Silas had made for Tommy through the long spring evenings on the porch with his knife and a block of pine, a horse of her own, so the old one could stay on the desk and belong to everybody and nobody. A thing let out of a shut room into the daylight at last. Silas was out at the schoolyard fence in his shirt sleeves, mending a rail that had come loose, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the gray at his temples bright in the sun. He was not cold anymore. You could see it in the way he stood, the way he stopped to watch the children run, the way he lifted a hand to his wife on the step and she lifted hers back. Some mornings he whistled. Dutch swore he'd never once in 6 years heard the man whistle before that spring, and now he could not be got to stop. Tommy stood at the front of the schoolroom with the primer in both hands, reading aloud to the little ones the way Adeline had taught her, careful and proud, her finger under each word, and her voice carried out the open window to the 2 grown people at the fence and the bell. A wagon went by on the road, some drummer headed north, and asked the man at the fence for the way to the county seat, and passed the time the way travelers do. Said he'd heard the Cattlemen's Trust was hiring on new men up in Cheyenne for anyone looking to better himself. I heard the same, Silas said, and he went back to his rail. And that was the last word anybody in Kestrel Bend ever wasted on Harlan Vance. Some prices are named in cattle, some are paid in years. Adeline Hartwell had buried her father and thought his will had sold her, and it had done no such thing. It had sent her to a frozen man with a rope in her hands that she didn't know she was throwing, and she had pulled him up into the light 2 miles at a time, 1 calf, 1 ledger, 1 open door at a time. 2 pairs of hands. That was all it had ever taken. That, and a woman too stubborn to weep, and a man who finally learned to stop. The bell rang out over the Green Range, and the children went in to their letters, and the schoolteacher and the rancher stood a while longer at the fence in the good spring sun before there was work to be done. If this story warmed you, tell me the name of the town you're watching from. I'd dearly love to know how far Adeline's bell has carried.